building on our previous discussion of embodied cognition and how color perception is tied to bodily action. Let's now formally introduce the concept of inaction. The core idea here is pretty radical. Perception and action aren't two separate processes that happen in sequence. They are fundamentally intertwined, like dance partners, evolved together over time. We can summarize the inactive approach with two key points, which we'll unpack further later. First, perception itself is guided by action. It's not just passive reception. Second, the very structures we use for thinking and understanding, our cognitive frameworks, emerge from the recurring patterns of how we interact with the world through our senses and movements. It's a dynamic, active process. Let's dig into that first point, perception as action guided. How does this differ from the traditional view? Think about the representationalist approach. For them, the big puzzle is figuring out how we reconstruct a pre-existing, objective reality from the raw data our senses feed us. It's like trying to assemble a picture from scattered pieces, assuming the full picture already existed. But the inactive view flips the script. It starts by asking, how does the perceiver actually navigate and act within their immediate situation? What matters isn't some abstract, independent world out there, but the specific way the perceiver's nervous system connects their senses to their muscles, the sensorimotor structure. This structure dictates how they can move and react, and how the environment shapes them. So, instead of chasing an elusive independent world, inaction focuses on the principles governing the tight coupling between sensing and acting, figuring out how perception guides action in a world that's inherently dependent on the perceiver's own capabilities and history. This perspective echoes some profound insights from Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He had this incredible vision. The organism isn't like a simple keyboard where external stimuli just strike keys and the notes are predefined. No, the organism actively contributes to shaping the very form of those stimuli it receives. It's a two-way street. He talks about object properties and subject intentions being interwoven, creating something entirely new. Think about tracking a bird in flight. Does the eye movement cause the visual input, or does the visual input drive the eye movement? It's impossible to say which came first. You could argue behavior is just an effect of the environment. But equally, you could argue that the stimuli the organism receives were only possible because of its prior movements positioning its eyes, head, etc. So, Merleau-Ponty concludes, the organism itself creates the form of the exciting agent through its way of offering itself to the world. It's the organism that selects which physical or chemical agents in the environment it will even be sensitive to, based on its own nature. Merleau-Ponty uses a fantastic analogy. Imagine a hammer striking a keyboard. If the keyboard itself moves rhythmically, it's offering specific keys to the hammer's blows. The keyboard isn't just passively receiving, it's participating in the interaction. This leads to the idea of the Umwelt, the unique lifestyle or environment experienced by each organism. This isn't just the physical space around it, but the world as shaped by and through the organism's active existence. It's a reciprocal relationship. The organism specifies the environment, and the environment specifies the organism. There's a constant back and forth, a mutual shaping. This means perception isn't just about taking in a world that exists independently. It's an active process where the perceiver helps to enact the very world they inhabit. Okay, enough philosophy, let's look at some hard evidence. Consider the classic Held and Hine experiment with kittens. They took kittens and raised them in total darkness. Then, they put them in controlled light conditions. Here's the clever part, they had two groups. One group of kittens could move around normally, but they were strapped into a cart that moved alongside another cart carrying the second group. Both groups saw the exact same visual scenes unfold. However, the second group was completely passive, just sitting there. After weeks, when released, the active kittens behaved perfectly fine. But the passive ones, they acted blind. They stumbled over objects, fell off tables. This beautifully supports the inactive view. Seeing isn't just about extracting features from light patterns. Seeing is about guiding action. The passive kittens didn't get the chance to learn how to visually guide their movements. They couldn't develop the necessary sensorimotor couplings. Now, what about humans? Bach and Rita developed a fascinating technology for blind individuals. They used a video camera connected to electrodes stimulating different points on the skin. Images captured by the camera were translated into patterns of vibration felt on the skin. Essentially, the camera's view was mapped onto tactile sensations. Crucially, These patterns didn't feel like visual images unless the person was actively moving their head, hands, or body to direct the camera. When the blind person engaged actively, something remarkable happened after hours of practice. They stopped interpreting the sensations as coming from their body. Instead, they started experiencing them as images projected in space, explored by the gaze of the camera attached to their body. To truly experience objects out there, they had to actively direct the camera, actively perceive and guide their actions. Passive reception wasn't enough. This link between perception and action isn't limited to sight. Look at olfaction, smell. Walter Freeman did groundbreaking work putting electrodes in rabbits' olfactory bulbs. He found that there wasn't a stable, global pattern of neural activity corresponding to a smell unless the rabbit had been exposed to that specific odor multiple times. These patterns seemed to emerge from a background of seemingly chaotic activity, settling into a coherent state. This suggests smell isn't just a passive recording of chemical molecules in the air. It's more like a creative, enacted significance built upon the animal's history and embodied experience. And get this, similar rapid dynamic neural oscillations have been found across the board, in cat and monkey visual cortex, in bird brains, even in simple invertebrates like the mollusk Hermesenda. This universality is huge. It implies this kind of dynamic neural processing isn't just a fancy feature of mammalian brains. It seems fundamental to how organisms enact sensorimotor couplings. Now let's connect this back to the second pillar of inaction. How cognitive structures emerge from sensorimotor patterns. Jean Piaget was a giant in this area. His project, Genetic Epistemology, aimed to explain how children develop from birth into rational adults. He started with the infant possessing only a basic sensorimotor system. How does intelligence, the ability to grasp an external world with permanent objects and a self as a thinking entity, arise from this? Piaget argued that even the simplest act of recognizing an object must be understood in terms of the child's own activity. The child isn't passively discovering a ready-made world. They are constructing it through their interactions. Cognitive structures, like the concept of an object, emerge from the repeated cycles of action and perception, what Piaget called circular reactions. It's learning through doing. But there's a fascinating tension in Piaget's work. While he presented the child as an active agent enacting their world, he himself never quite abandoned the underlying assumption of a pre-existing objective world and a final goal of logical understanding, towards which development progresses via assimilation and accommodation. It's like a theorist who studies dancers, but secretly believes there's a perfect ballet form everyone should eventually reach. Despite this, categorization remains a cornerstone of cognition. We take the infinite variety of experiences and slot them into a limited set of meaningful categories. In the heyday of behaviorism, these categories were often seen as arbitrary labels learned through conditioning. But the inactive view suggests otherwise. Even though mind and world co-emerge, the way they emerge in any given situation isn't random. There's a structure to it. Rosh's research really highlights this structured emergence. Why do we typically call this chair a chair rather than furniture or armchair? She identified several characteristics of what she called the basic level of categorization. Objects at this level tend to be used for similar actions, look somewhat similar, have easily identifiable features, are the ones children learn first, and have linguistic priority. Think about it. The basic level seems to be where the rubber meets the road for both cognition and environment. The object presents itself as an offerer of certain interactions affordances, and we interact with it in ways validated by our culture and biology. It's the sweet spot where the sensorimotor coupling feels most natural and informative. Mark Johnson takes this further with his idea of image schemas. He proposes we have fundamental cognitive blueprints derived directly from our bodily experiences. Think schemas like container, inside, outside, part, whole, or source, path, goal. These aren't abstract concepts. They're grounded in physical experience. They have a basic logic, in or out, and can be projected metaphorically onto countless domains. We understand visual fields using the container schema, things enter or exit my view. We understand relationships using it, entering or leaving a relationship. We even use it for set theory. Johnson argues these schemas emerge from basic sensorimotor activities and provide a preconceptual foundation. Our more complex concepts are built upon these, using metaphorical and metonymic projections that aren't arbitrary, but are deeply rooted in our embodied experience. Sweetzer's linguistic work backs this up, showing how words evolve through these metaphorical extensions, like see, evolving to mean understand. George Lakoff and Johnson crystallized these ideas in their Experientialist Manifesto. Their core argument is powerful. Meaningful concepts don't spring fully formed from logic alone. They arise from two sources. First, the structured nature of our bodily and social experiences, and second, our innate ability to project aspects of these experiences imaginatively onto abstract domains. Rational thought, then, is just applying general cognitive tools like focusing or analyzing to these experientially grounded conceptual structures. This framework, emphasizing the grounding of meaning in experience and the role of imaginative projection, resonates strongly with the enactive view of cognition we've been exploring. It suggests our understanding of the world is always already shaped by how we are embodied and embedded in our social context. Can we extend this enactive thinking to cultural knowledge? Think about folktales, the names for local fish, jokes. Where do they reside? Is it just in individual minds? Or in societal rules, or in books and artifacts? Anthropology struggles with explaining the variations we see over time and between different people. The text proposes a provocative idea. Maybe knowledge isn't stored somewhere fixed but emerges at the interface between the individual mind, the social context, and the cultural tools. It's enacted in specific situations, when someone tells a story, when someone identifies a fish. The knowledge doesn't pre-exist in a neat compartment. It comes into being through the act of enacting it. This opens up exciting possibilities for anthropology, suggesting a focus on the dynamic process of enactment rather than static storage locations. Merleau-Ponty also offered a different take on psychopathology, moving away from Freud's focus on repressed memories and representations. He called his approach ontological, focusing on the person's being in the world. For him, a character disorder wasn't just about unresolved conflicts, it was about a fundamental way of being stuck. A particular theme, say, a deep-seated feeling of inferiority or superiority, becomes so central through early experiences that it becomes the only lens through which the person views the world. It's like the only light available, making comparison impossible. Existential psychoanalysis builds on this, viewing various character issues not as illnesses, but as fundamental choices about how one exists in the world. However, this rich phenomenological description, while insightful, doesn't immediately offer specific therapeutic techniques beyond what other schools might already use, like exploring origins, transference, or body work. Could we bridge this gap? The text suggests that the open, alert approach to experience we've discussed, the kind that emphasizes embodiment and present moment awareness, might provide the tools for an enactive psychotherapy. The goal here would be recorporealization, helping individuals reconnect with their embodied selves and lived experience. Interestingly, this connects to ongoing discussions and debates among Western practitioners about meditation, Buddhist teachings, and therapy. While Western psychotherapy is a distinct cultural phenomenon, many meditators and therapists explore these intersections. The text invites us to ponder, what would an inactive, recorporealizing psychoanalysis, truly open and grounded in lived experience, actually look like in practice? All right, let's anticipate a common counter-argument. Someone might say, okay, I agree, perception is tied to action, cognition is embodied. But surely, the reason we perceive the world this way isn't just arbitrary history. Isn't it because evolution, through natural selection, shaped us to be optimal for survival? Our color vision, our categorization skills, they must be the best possible solutions for navigating our ancestral environment. This argument pops up everywhere in cognitive science, from computational models to ecological approaches, and even sometimes within enactivist circles. It represents a significant retreat back towards adaptationism, using natural selection as the ultimate justification for the specific ways our cognitive systems are structured. We need to examine this carefully. Let's start with color vision again. Humans are trichromats. We have 3 types of cone cells, allowing us to represent color in 3 dimensions. This seems pretty standard among primates. But look at the rest of the animal kingdom. Fish, amphibians, birds, many have vast different systems. Some are dichromats, 2 dimensions, some are tetrachromats, 4 dimensions, like goldfish and pigeons. Maybe even pentachromats, 5 dimensions, possibly in some birds. Their underlying neuromachinery is often completely different from ours. So if our color categories are the optimal solution, why do other species have such different, equally viable color worlds? Just because their brains work differently doesn't mean they're less adapted or successful. People often ask, where are the other colors they see? Implying they just see more of the same colors we do. But that misses the point. A four-dimensional color space is fundamentally different from a three-dimensional one. They're incommensurable. There's no direct way to measure or compare the richness of a 4D experience using our 3D terms. Imagine trying to describe a 4D space by adding a time dimension to color. You'd need terms like fast pink or slow blue. We simply can't conceive of what it's like to have a five-dimensional color experience. Our three-dimensional world is just one possible outcome of evolutionary history, one viable path, not necessarily the optimal or intended solution. The adaptationist might respond, okay, fine, there's diversity. But each species' color vision is optimally adapted to its specific niche. Birds see ultraviolet because it helps them find prey or mates in their environment. Fish see differently because of water penetration. Each group exploits different regularities in their world, achieving their own optimal adaptation. This sounds more sophisticated, doesn't it? It acknowledges diversity while still clinging to the core idea of optimization. But is this refined version truly explanatory, or does it just shift the goalposts? It still assumes there's a fitness landscape to be climbed, just with different peaks for different species. Let's dig deeper into the foundations of evolutionary theory to see if this holds water. To properly evaluate this refined adaptationism, we need to look at the broader landscape of evolutionary biology. Just as representation is the central organizing principle for much of contemporary cognitive science, adaptation is the central organizing principle for recent evolutionary biology. However, just like in cognitive science, this dominant paradigm is facing serious challenges. Over the past few decades, numerous criticisms have emerged, leading to a major revision of what was once a seemingly unified field. The orthodox theory being challenged is neo-Darwinism. Think of neo-Darwinism as the equivalent of cognitivism in cognitive science, a powerful, influential framework that provides a clear narrative but is now being questioned from multiple fronts. Neo-Darwinism arose from Darwin's original insights, synthesized in the 1930s with modern genetics. The core tenets are familiar. Evolution happens through reproduction and heredity, leading to gradual change over generations. Genetic material constantly diversifies through mutations and recombination. And crucially, natural selection acts as the primary mechanism, choosing the design's phenotypes that best cope with the environment, thereby increasing their reproductive success. The whole enterprise is often framed as evolution optimizing organisms for fitness. Fitness here typically means reproductive success, the ability to pass genes to the next generation. This quantitative view allows for measuring adaptation. But let's be precise about adaptation. Intuitively, we think of it as perfect design, like a fish fin perfectly suited for swimming. However, evolutionary biologists often use adaptation to refer specifically to the process of adapting, the ongoing struggle to survive and reproduce. The observed design is the result of this process. How do we measure success in this process? The classic measure is fitness, often equated with abundance. How many offspring does an individual produce, or how fast does a population grow? But this has problems. Success depends on finding mates, genes rarely have isolated effects, and the environment changes constantly. An alternative is to measure fitness as persistence, the probability of avoiding extinction over the long run. This seems more robust, but it's incredibly hard to measure directly. Despite its appeal, the neo-Darwinian orthodoxy, particularly its reliance on optimization for explaining all biological features, faces significant hurdles. Empirical observations and theoretical puzzles have forced biologists to broaden their horizons. Several key issues challenge the simple adaptationist narrative. We'll touch on several: the tangled web of genes, linkage and pleiotropy, the constraints imposed by development, the unpredictable role of random chance genetic drift, the puzzling phenomenon of evolutionary stasis, and the question of who or what is actually being selected units of selection. These challenges suggest evolution might be more complex and less goal-directed than the classic picture suggests. First up, genes aren't independent Lego bricks. They're linked together on chromosomes, and a single gene often influences multiple traits. That's pleiotropy. The genome is more like a complex interconnected network than a simple list. Think about the genetic link between being left-handed and susceptibility to celiac disease. That involves countless metabolic pathways. This presents a huge problem for adaptationism. How can natural selection optimize a gene if it has conflicting effects? Selection might favor one trait linked to the gene, while pleiotropy pulls it in another direction. The result is often a compromise, a suboptimal solution, not a perfectly tuned design. The neo-Darwinian response is often to hope that finer measurements will eventually disentangle these effects, or that selection will eventually break the linkage. But so far this hasn't fully resolved the issue. Development is another major constraint. Neo-Darwinism often jumps from genes to the final adult organism, skipping the messy middle step of embryology. But biologists know development isn't just passive unfolding. The processes of morphogenesis, how structures form, are incredibly constrained by cellular choreographies. Think about fruit fly development. Early segmentation establishes a kind of grammar dictating possible body plans and transformations. Mutations often cause related structures to swap places, reflecting these underlying developmental rules. Similarly, the stripe and spot patterns in mammals follow predictable mathematical models based on developmental dynamics. The key takeaway is that the self-organizing properties of embryonic landscapes and genetic networks are powerful intrinsic factors shaping evolution, not just passive consequences of selection. Of course, we shouldn't oversimplify this into an internal versus external dichotomy. It's a complex interplay. Then there's the role of pure chance, genetic drift. Evolution isn't always a smooth climb towards the fittest. Sometimes, it's more like a drunken stumble. One source of randomness is hitchhiking. If a beneficial gene is located near other neutral genes, those neutral genes might get swept along to higher frequencies just because of proximity. Another, perhaps more profound source is finite population size. In any finite population, allele frequencies fluctuate randomly from generation to generation due to sampling error. Just like flipping a coin repeatedly, you expect some variation. This drift can cause genetic changes even when selection isn't acting on those specific genes. This means evolution happens alongside selection, driven by luck. A striking piece of evidence is junk DNA, vast stretches of non-coding repetitive sequences. From a strict adaptationist view, why would so much useless genetic baggage accumulate? Drift offers a plausible explanation. We also observe widespread stasis, periods where groups remain remarkably stable morphologically for millions of years, even through major environmental upheavals. Consider the plethodontid salamanders. They've persisted with very little change for over 50 million years, surviving mass extinctions that wiped out all their contemporary vertebrate relatives. Their environment has changed dramatically, yet their basic body plan remained largely constant. Current populations show high genetic diversity, suggesting they haven't been stagnant internally. This raises questions about focusing solely on maximizing offspring numbers. Maybe persistence, simply avoiding extinction, is a better long-term measure of adaptive success than short-term abundance. The classic neo-Darwinian focus on climbing the fitness peak doesn't fully capture this endurance. Finally, the question of units of selection. Is it always the individual organism being selected? Many plausible theories suggest selection operates at multiple levels simultaneously. On one end, you have the selfish gene hypothesis focusing on DNA sequences. On the other, you have group selection, potentially explaining altruism. Everything in between, cells, genomes, inclusive gene groups, social groups, populations, species, even ecosystems, could be units of selection, each with its own evolutionary dynamics and constraints. While debates often involve dismissing alternative levels, the future of evolutionary theory likely involves understanding the complex relationships between these different levels of selection. So, what's the bottom line? The idea that every biological feature can be neatly explained as an optimal adaptation to a predefined environmental challenge is becoming increasingly untenable, both logically and empirically. As Richard Lewontin put it, biologists are abandoning the ascent to Mount Fitness. We need a broader theoretical framework. And here's the crucial connection. The same kind of reasoning applies to cognitive science. When cognitive scientists invoke evolution to explain why we have certain cognitive abilities, they often rely on this adaptationist logic. If adaptationism in evolutionary biology is flawed, then the representationalist explanations in cognitive science that lean heavily on optimization become significantly weaker. The two fields face parallel challenges rooted in the same problematic assumption of universal optimization. The text uses a great analogy to illustrate this shift. Imagine Juan needs a suit. In a purely representational world, he goes to a tailor, gets measured meticulously, and gets a suit perfectly tailored to those exact specs. It's about matching an internal representation to an external standard. Alternatively, in a selectionist world, Juan goes to a store and picks a suit from available options. It might not fit perfectly, but it's appropriate, chosen based on some criteria of fitness like comfort or style. This is closer to optimization, but the real world is more complex. Juan's choice isn't isolated. He thinks about how the suit affects his boss, his girlfriend, his social image. The decision is embedded in his entire life situation. He satisfies loose constraints like looking decent, but he's not optimizing for any single external metric. This mirrors the move from rigid optimization to navigating complex constraints and satisficing in both evolution and cognition. So what comes after adaptationism? The proposal is to shift from a prescriptive logic where selection dictates the optimal path to a proscriptive logic where selection merely eliminates the incompatible. Selection acts as a filter, ensuring viability, not necessarily directing towards an ideal design. This opens the door to embracing the staggering diversity of life. Evolution isn't about finding the best solution, it's about finding any viable solution. Think of it as satisficing, not optimizing. Or, as Francois Jacob famously put it, evolution is bricolage, tinkering with whatever parts are available, creating functional combinations without necessarily aiming for elegance or perfection. This perspective allows traits and cognitive abilities to exist precisely because they are useful in some context, even if they seem irrelevant or overly specific from a purely survival or reproductive standpoint. Concepts like adaptation, problem solving, and simplicity lose their central explanatory power. This leads to a proposed alternative framework, evolution by neutral drift. It rests on four key pillars. First, the unit of evolution at any level is a network capable of generating a rich repertoire of self-organizing configurations. Second, structural coupling with an environment generates selection, which acts as a satisficing filter, triggering changes but not dictating their specific form. Third, the actual trajectory of change is the result of the entangled outcomes of multiple interacting subnetworks, not a single optimal path. Fourth, the old dichotomy between internal factors and external selection is replaced by co-implicativity, where the organism and its environment continuously specify each other. This replaces the neo-Darwinian view with a more dynamic, network-based, and reciprocal understanding of evolutionary change. This post-Darwinian view relies on three key conditions. First, biological networks possess an immense richness of potential self-organizing configurations. Second, there must be a mode of structural coupling with the environment that allows for satisficing viable trajectories to persist. Third, the system is composed of modular subnetworks, independent processes that interact and influence each other. Together, these elements form a framework that explains evolutionary change not as a relentless march towards optimization, but as a dynamic interplay of internal network dynamics, environmental interaction, and the emergence of viable, though not necessarily optimal, solutions. It offers a richer, more nuanced picture of how life evolves.